Well, Neil Castaldo, you are admired as a consummate business counselor. You have advised corporations, you've advised institutions throughout your career. I know you developed a specialty in healthcare law, and through your representations of hospitals and other healthcare institutions, you've affected the fortune of the people of New Hampshire. So you are to be congratulated on a career well led.
Thank you very much, Susan. I'm a little taken aback by the introduction because it doesn't sound very much like me, although I appreciate the thought. I'd like to be that person that you introduced.
Well, I think you are. I think you are. We'll flush that. We'll try to flush that out in this interview. So you and I have known each other since the early 1970s. We were both fledgling associates at Orr and Reno. We both spent substantial parts of our careers at Orr and Reno, although somewhat at different times, not always at the same times, I should say. I would note that the 70th anniversary of Orr and Reno is coming up soon. And I would also note that we were both toddlers when Dudley Orr and Bob Reno formed the firm. And I think both of us were very much influenced by them and by the other lawyers that they corralled and practiced with. In many ways, it's fitting, I think, that you're back there as senior counsel. I think that if I were to characterize you as an attorney, looking back on all you've done, I would probably make the comparison and say the same thing that was said last night on PBS on the NewsHour about Gwen Ifill, that she practiced her trade with grace, with intelligence, and with great integrity. And I think that sums up what I think about you, having watched you all these years. So let's talk a little bit about your career. And then you've suggested, and I think it's a great idea, that we reminisce a little bit about some of the titans, as you said, and other, quote, characters that in the bar who have influenced you in the practice of law. So why don't you start and give us a little bit about the history of your career and some of the high points.
Well, thank you, Susan. It was an extremely gracious introduction, and I'm pleased to my core that you would think those things about me. And I'd like to be that person, and I hope on a day-by-day basis that I can come closer to that goal. Our entry into the New Hampshire bar was under different circumstances. You had to crash through barriers and ceilings as the first woman virtually wherever you were in New Hampshire. The first woman at Orr and Reno, pick anything that you want and that you want to identify, and you were the first. And I was just a tag-along white male riding the crest of the tidal wave at the time. In 1970, it was the Back to the Garden movement. The cities were in turmoil. We had the riots of '68, the assassinations, the riots of '69, the assassinations. And in my law school class, and in law school classes all across the country, as I was interviewing in 1969, law students didn't want to go to cities. They wanted to go to places that were relatively free of the turmoil of the time. And I had clerked for a firm in Los Angeles the summer of my second year, and had an offer there. I had an offer in New York, and I had an offer in Atlanta. And after a very memorable interview with our firm. I had an offer from Orr and Reno in Concord, New Hampshire, and I decided to come to Concord, and I haven't regretted it. Actually, when I look at my retirement account balance, I may regret it then. But other than that, it has been just the most wonderful ride. And I think what I'd like to do is, first of all, tell you a story about your husband, because it was classic Chuck Leahy. I see this firm in Concord, New Hampshire. I'm looking at Martindale Hubbell, and it had 9 or 10 people listed. All but one graduated from Harvard or Yale law schools. And the one who didn't, Dick Kauser, what a guy, was Order of the Coif at Stanford. So I said, well, this is just a waste of time for me at Vanderbilt Law School to try to get a job there. So I sent an interview, to my surprise. I sent a letter, I got an interview, and Chuck was going to interview me. So I traveled from Nashville to Concord, New Hampshire for this interview. It's the only interview I had in New Hampshire. Stayed at the motel, which is now the Days Inn on Route 93. Got up, got all cleaned up, was ready for my law school interview, went to Orr and Reno, and was greeted by Mary Quinn. Do you remember Mary?
Yes, I do.
What a woman.
Yeah.
She was both charming and cantankerous all at the same time. And she sized me up and thought I could stay at least so that she would announce me to Chuck. And then she went back, looked for Chuck, couldn't find him. So she came back and said, well, I'm sorry, but Mr. Leahy's not here. And I said, well, gee, I had this interview with him today, and I've traveled about 1,500 miles. And Mary said, sorry, she's not either. Nobody else wants to see you. Nobody else knows why you're here. So I said, well, what do you think I should do? And she looked at me very carefully and said, come back tomorrow. So I said, okay. And I spent another night at the Days Inn, but I went up just on a lark to Lebanon, New Hampshire, and knocked on Charlie Tesreau's door. Do you remember Charlie?
No, I
He
don't.
was a lawyer in Lebanon who had a monopoly on all the farmers up there
Okay.
in Lebanon. And Larry Gardner was his brand new associate.
Okay.
And I knocked on the door, and they were delightful. They entertained me for an hour and talked about law in New Hampshire. And I went and showed up the next day, and there was Chuck on time for the interview, a little sheepish about missing it. I don't think he even got it on his calendar.
Oh, my gosh.
And maybe because of that embarrassment, but probably not, probably because it was just who Chuck was. He was charming, totally charming. And he knocked my socks off. And then he brought me in to see Dudley Orr, and I left like on a hospital gurney with the IV going. I was so bowled
Pumped
over
up.
by these two
Yeah.
people, and it was the start of my career in New Hampshire.
Wow.
I said no to New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, and put my lot in with the smart guys.
Wow.
It was terrific.
Wow. So you went to Dartmouth College.
I did.
Did that influence in any way, at least the writing the letter?
It most definitely
Yeah.
did. Most definitely did. And I knew New Hampshire. I knew its rural nature, having spent 4 years in Hanover when Hanover was really rural. I live in Hanover now, and the alumni have totally ruined Hanover. Myself, I'm a part of that
Yes.
ruination.
Yeah.
It still has a charm as a town, but when I lived in Hanover, there wasn't a single stoplight in the town. There was a blinker at the Hanover Inn corner, and it was farmers, students, and faculty. That was what was in Hanover. but I liked it. And so I thought coming to Concord would be very similar, and it has been. It has been.
Great. That's great. So talk a little bit about, you had a partnership with one of our former law partners at Orr & Reno, Leo Lynn. Do you want to say a few words about Leo?
Leo, God rest his soul. Leo, who died recently
Yes.
After a long illness, was my best friend for about 10 years. My totally best friend. And he had his struggles, especially after his son, Bobby, died of leukemia at around age 5. It might have been 6.
Yeah.
And Leo was never the same after that, in my view. But up until then, he was smart and had integrity and would always try to do the right thing, even if it took him hours and hours and hours of reading through boring documents. He would not take shortcuts. And I had been at Orr & Reno for maybe 11 years, something like that. And for whatever reason, Leo had left. And about 3 months after he left, he came to me and said, "Neil, would you be my partner?"
That's interesting.
It was a crisis of choice for me. I loved Orr & Reno, and I loved Leo as my best friend. And maybe as I look on it now, it was pretty clear that Leo needed me more than Orr & Reno did. Orr & Reno had you,
Many others.
Bill Chapman,
Yeah.
lots of people who could continue that tradition and trajectory. And Leo needed help. So I joined Leo, and we had a firm, and it was a great ride. I remember at the end of our first year, our accountants, maybe they were the same ones that Dudley Orr used, Peisch in Vermont.
Oh, I don't know if that didn't, Orr & Reno used Tillinghast, I think.
Oh, it was before that.
Okay.
Archibald Peisch, I think, was maybe a Dartmouth classmate of Dudley's.
Okay.
And so they sent some junior guys, and they sat Leo and I down, and they said, "Okay, you've had a really successful first year." He said, "Your revenues have been $300,000. And I had two reactions. First of all, where the hell did all that money come from?
That's right.
And secondly, if we had that much money, how much why weren't we making more?"
It's just the two of you,
Yeah,
right?
right. So it turns out we had secretaries. Back then, you remember, Susan, Leo had a secretary, I had a secretary. We had an office.
A receptionist.
A receptionist, lots of expenses. But I remember being proud that Leo and I had made it, that we were going to have a career in that little firm.
And so when that partnership ended, you came back to Orr & Reno. Did you come back to Orr & Reno after that?
That was, yes.
Yes, that's what I thought.
Ultimately, I think I hold two distinctions at Orr & Reno. Number one, I lead in the number of departures from the firm. 2. Once, when Leo asked me to be his partner in 1981, and once in 2001, when my financial situation was rocky and I got an offer from a regional firm, Hinckley Allen, to start its New Hampshire office, and it was the money was attractive. And while I lead in the number of departures from Orr & Reno, I also lead, and perhaps this is a record never to be equaled, in the number of times I joined Orr & Reno.
That's true, because it's 3
I
times,
joined
right?
3 times. So on 3 separate occasions, I decided that Orr & Reno was the right firm for me. And the one you were referencing, Lyndon Castaldo started in 81, and then Leo left and went to the Gallagher office with a lot of good people over there, and it became Castaldo, Hanna, and Momberg.
Oh, that's right.
Kate Hanna and John Momberg.
That's right.
And then Steve Weiner joined, and then Steve Weil joined, And then Kate left, Steve Weil left, and it was Castaldo and Momberg in 1991, and it was there was a bank recession then, and business was off, and we had too many lawyers. We had maybe 6 or 7 lawyers, and we got together and we decided to join another firm, and we talked with Devine, we talked with Tom Rath, and had interesting prospects all over. But Orrin Reno was the one, and maybe you and Chuck were at the lead of this, who would take all 6 or 7 of our lawyers.
I remember that.
And the other 2 wanted different configurations of us depending on their particular needs. And we were all struck by that because we wanted to stay together. And so we joined. I think it was 1994, actually.
Okay.
I correct the date, 1994. And it was really nice to be back home.
Well, I think one of the things that really attracted us at the time to having you back was the fact that you were so passionate about everybody in my firm needs to be able to come on board.
Yeah, that was the deal. And in that fateful last meeting, Molly Ganger, now my wife, was our only associate, and we had her come too, and we sat in the conference room and we decided, what's best for us, and we liked each other. Mm-hmm. We wanted to stay together, so there was not much of a decision. And thankfully, Chuck, you, Ron, were willing to take a risk on all of us. And John Momberg is still at Orrin Reno, and Steve Weiner's still at Orrin Reno, and Molly left after our first child, and now I'm back.
And then at some point, relate this story. I guess my recollection of the Hinckley Allen experience when you brought actually Hinckley Allen up to New Hampshire from Boston, in effect, and started very small and built that into the wonderful firm it is today. That they had one lawyer up here who was renting from one of your rental properties, renting his office space from you. Is that how that all started?
Yeah, that was just fascinating. Michael Conley, who is an expert litigator, criminal defense lawyer, expert, really good, had joined Hinckley Allen in its Boston office and was tired of the bus. Mm-hmm. And he rented an office from me for a while just to hang his hat when he just couldn't take the bus any longer. And he and I had breakfast, and he said he finally convinced Hinckley Allen that it should consider opening a New Hampshire office. And we had breakfast, liked each other, and I was in a financial bind at the time in terms of my divorce and other matters. And Orrin Reno always had a very egalitarian pay system, and so I gave it some thought. And then I had a dinner meeting at the Common Man. It's really funny.
In Ashland, or the one?
No, in Concord.
In Concord.
And this was 2001 in the winter, and it was snowing like crazy. I had a meeting up at Dartmouth Hitchcock and drove down in the snow, skidding all over the road. The management people from Hinckley Allen drove up from Providence, skidding all over the snow, and we met Michael at the Common Man. The managing partner at Hinckley Allen, Mick DeFanti, what a titan he was a foodie. And he comes into the Common Man and he sees a burger place, and he was just befuddled by this. He was just befuddled. And we talked, and I basically said, "What are you doing here? Why didn't you cancel this meeting?" And he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" And we talked, and Hinckley Allen was, and probably still is, one of the best managed firms that I can imagine. And they were extremely profitable and had a terrific perspective. And so I gave them a number, and I said, listen, if you can hit this number, and it was twice my salary, if you can hit this number, I'll think about it. And they hit it.
Oh, wow.
And so I said, well, geez, it's hard to turn down.
Yeah.
But I remember telling, at the time, quite unfortunately, I was president of Orono, and I remember calling a meeting. I hadn't said anything to anybody at Orono to tell them of my decision. And it was an emotional moment for me. And I said something like, I'm really sorry, because I love this place, but this is the finances of this are just too attractive for me to turn down. And I choked up and stopped talking. And Ron Snow, who at the time, at that particular instant in time, was mad as hell at me for wanting to leave, but knowing, if you know Ron, you knew Ron well, he was also quite protective of me too. And he said something like, Neil, I spent a lot of years protecting you, and I'm not going to stop now. So I'm sorry you're going, but we'll do everything we can to make it smooth. And it just literally pained him to say that.
Yeah.
But it also, he was such a good guy, he could not help but say that at the same time. And he passed away, and I remember him fondly. I learned a lot from Ron.
Yeah, he was a remarkable man, remarkable lawyer.
Really?
Yeah. So let's start in on your list.
Okay.
And I think you already know who I'm going to pick to have you reminisce about first, which is Freddie Castaldo.
Oh, Freddie.
We just saw his obituary in the Bar News.
I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, he passed away this summer, I think. And it turns out he had written the story of his life.
Did he?
Yes, and I haven't read it, but his children quoted in the obituary some of his philosophy of life. And
can you remember the thread of his, the gist of his philosophy?
The gist of it was kind of that a lot of bad, unfortunate things happen to people in life. I lost my wife. I was badly injured in an airplane crash. I, didn't have enough resources to keep going. I had a family to take care of. I had my law degree, and you can't feel sorry for yourself when these things happen to you. You got to keep going, and you got to count your blessings. Basically, is what he said, in a much more elegant way than what I'm saying.
So Freddie was a total hustler. He would drum up business left and right, all kinds of business, and he was a character. The rest of us, the men in the bar at the time, were wearing dark suits and white shirts, and Freddie was flamboyant, and I totally disappeared into the grayness of the white male picture, and Freddie totally stood out. He would, I think he had necklaces, he wouldn't wear a necktie, and he had big rings and watches, and he was just a force of nature. So people would get us confused. Neil Castaldo, Freddie Castaldo. My middle name is Frederick. I don't think that added to it, but maybe it did, I don't know. And so I'm sure people met Freddie and thought it was me, and I know people met me and thought I was Freddie. And I'd have a ball with it. I'd tease him just a little bit about it before disclosing that I wasn't Freddie Castaldo, and nobody could be, only Freddie Castaldo could have his joie de vivre and perspective on the world. And I was just plain old boring Neil Castaldo.
Did you have any interaction with him?
Oh, yeah.
Did you have cases?
I had, it wasn't a case. Do you remember when Malcolm McLean ran for governor?
Yes.
So Malcolm Malcolm took me to a meeting over in the Seacoast. And he took me there to keep notes and to make sure. He told me that if he said something wrong, I would help him out. And we met Freddie Castaldo there, who was in the audience, and Freddie was peppering Malcolm with questions. Some of them were directly on point, and some of them were just from left field. I wish I could remember some of them. So improbable. And after the meeting, Freddie and I got together, and we had a good laugh about what he was doing. And he was grandstanding. And in front of the people, it got him so charged up. And I said, Freddie, why did you ask? I don't know what the question was. And he said, I don't remember asking that. Did I ask that? And I said, yes, that along with about 10 others in the same vein. And he laughed and said, oh, man, I'm such a character.
Well, I still drive by his old office.
Do you?
When I come from Kennebunkport to Concord through Dover, so.
You know, the New Hampshire bar, Susan, you know, because you lived it, you are it. When I came, I don't know how many people, I think I was the 245th person in the bar, because that's my bar number. What's your bar number? Do you know?
I can't remember. Oh, yeah.
Mine is 245. And
it does have a 0 in front of it, so I'm below 1,000, I know that.
Yeah. So, and we're different by a year.
Yeah.
And so when I came into the bar, it was a fraternity, because you hadn't arrived yet. And that woman who was in the Attorney General's office,
Lila Maynard?
Yeah. She might have been in it at the time.
Yeah.
So it was mainly a fraternity. And you knew everybody, especially if you did any litigation.
Yes.
You just knew everybody. I think it's different now. Not sure. But you knew everybody. It was like the cast of a play. Everybody had a role. Everybody knew, you knew by reputation. I remember closing a financing with John Pendleton in the lobby of the old New Hampshire Savings Bank, and my client was with us. I was trying to get John into an office, and he didn't have time. So we closed the transaction. I had my client sign on the wall the documents, and I gave them to John, and John gave us an authority to go to the teller to get the money. And this client's like, what's going on? And Pendleton said, well, that's the way we do things with people we trust.
You don't have to show your driver's license either, right?
No.
What you do now to get a home mortgage.
No, and there are, in that 245 or 400 or 500, almost everybody you could trust.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
It was really fun to practice in that environment.
Well, as you know, I law clerked for a year in the New Hampshire Supreme Court before I came to Orono, and after that 1 year, I sat in on all the oral arguments, and I felt the same way. I felt, before I was even actually practicing law and I was just law clerking, that I knew virtually everybody in the state. If I didn't know them, the attorneys, I knew of them.
So do you think that was a good thing?
I think it was a very good thing, and I think it was very, it was good for clients, and I think it made the practice of law really enjoyable in a way that is probably a thing of the past.
I think that's true. I think now there's a lot of emphasis in law school, and especially in big urban firms, on the technician aspect of law. I was talking with a father of a lawyer who is a woman in New York City. She's at one of the big white shoe firms. She's been there for 5 years, and he said she's getting tired of it, as I predicted she would when she took the job 5 years ago. And I said, well, tell me why. And he said, well, this firm, their view is that they will outwork anybody on the other side and overwhelm them with paper and arguments. And it is the firm policy more detailed and to be more aggressive than anybody else. And I said, well, I can see why she doesn't like that.
That's right.
You know, that just being one of 25 hammers
Yeah.
in the toolbox, and the partner who's running the case takes the hammers out and starts banging people, that doesn't seem to me like fun.
And it may not achieve the client's goals either ultimately, or at least not without incredible expense.
Definitely with incredible expense, and may not achieve the best result.
Yeah. Yeah.
But maybe, Susan, we're being nostalgic about a time that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, is it possible to be a sympathetic advisor when everything is so based on the details of cases produced by internet searches and access to so much data? Is it possible to advise at a higher level than the details?
I mean, I think it's possible to advise, and I think that's one of the things that you've done so well over the years. You're a true counselor, which is getting through all the baloney and focusing on the big picture, and then, you know.
Well, you're kind to say that, but I'll disclose a secret. Not that much of a secret, because I haven't been shy about saying this. I was never the smartest person in the room, ever. You know how the Enron guys, they wrote
Yes.
the book, The Smartest Guys in the Room?
Right.
I was never that, especially when dealing with physicians, hospital administrators, businessmen. And I think the fact that I was just of ordinary intelligence in a room full of really smart people, I was able to see things that they missed, like the big things. So every now and then, they'd be wallowing around in the details. I'd say, well, what's the big picture here? What are we basically trying to achieve? And then people would look at me and say, oh man, he's really smart. All I did was say the obvious.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if anybody's watching this, I would encourage people, when advising clients, to start with the obvious. Because sometimes it gets lost, and you need to come back to what the important thing is. You ask, what's important? What are we basically trying to achieve? And then think about that.
Well, tell us a little bit about sort of your developing your healthcare practice. I mean, because I think you did work way back in the dark ages for the Concord Clinic, which had been an Orono client, and you developed this huge business relationship with Dartmouth Hitchcock as it reinvented itself over the years. Talk a little bit about your...
This is a matter of total serendipity, Sue. In 1975, you might not remember this, at Orono, I had just made partner, and I was in that little office overlooking the alley into Chris Gallagher's office.
Oh, yes.
Do you remember that?
I was next door to you in the windowless one.
Were you?
Yes.
Oh, because I had a year's seniority on you.
Yeah.
Well, Chris and I would occasionally wave to each other across the alleyway. Well, I'm sitting in that room, and it was kind of a rickety room, and Bob Reno came in with the brand new executive director at the Hitchcock Clinic, John Collins. And much to my surprise, he sits John down, who was a year younger than me, and he says to John, okay, I've represented the Hitchcock Clinic since 1945, 30 years. And it's time to pass the baton on to a younger, stronger runner. And here he is. So I had no advance notice of this, and I think the idea just hit Bob, and maybe he was on to something else. So John and I look at each other, and Bob leaves, and each of us had a choice. is this going to work, or is he just going to stand up and leave and say, this is ridiculous? I don't know who you are. So we started working together, and I think maybe others, Gene Van Loan, Dave Barnes, might have different memories, and I would respect them if they did. But I think I was really the first one to think, lawyer in New Hampshire, to think about health care as a specialty. Mm-hmm. And so I developed this with Hitchcock Clinic, and then Mary Hitchcock Hospital, the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, the Concord Clinic, hospitals around the state. I ended up representing, for various reasons, at least 20 of the 26 hospitals.
Wow.
And so I was the first person, I think, who was acknowledged to be a health lawyer, whatever that meant. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure I knew what it meant other than my clients wore white coats. Mm-hmm. And when the first list of best lawyers came out that included healthcare as a specialty, I was named as the best lawyer in healthcare. Mm-hmm. And I want to say something to the people out there about these best lawyer lists. The best lawyer lists are important only to the people who aren't on them. The people who are on them, at least when I looked at the best lawyer lists, I would say, well, they forgot him and her and him and her, and what am I doing on it because the people on it are way better than me? And so they're only important if you're not on it, because you want to be on it. But once you're on it, you realize it's not a legitimate distinction. Mm-hmm. And maybe that gave impetus to my career. And I had a wonderful healthcare career until it got too complicated. Our healthcare system today, this is the topic of another speech. And by the way, I'm giving it tomorrow to Lucy Hodder's class in this building tomorrow afternoon about what's wrong with healthcare, and a lot of things are wrong with it. But from the 70s through the early teens of this century, healthcare was manageable and understandable. And then in an effort to reform healthcare, the Affordable Care Act was passed. I was in favor of it and am still in favor of it, although it's not healthcare reform. The Affordable Care Act is insurance reform, health insurance reform. Big difference. And I think we need healthcare reform in this country, but the political will isn't there. Mm-hmm. Health care has been wonderful. I've met a lot of interesting people, a lot of interesting situations, but now it's tough business. It's increasing costs, decreasing volumes and revenues, increasing regulation, layoffs, salary cutbacks. It's tough. It's a tough business.
We were talking before this film started with the filming crew about that very thing, that when you started practicing healthcare law, it was quite a different environment than it is now. And I didn't realize that that's the reason that you'd said enough is enough. But it's just almost mind-boggling to think about advising a large healthcare institution with all the myriad of things that are going on, political pressure from everywhere, regulation, just the ordinary business ups and downs, insurance. It must be mind-boggling.
Well, in 2010, the Affordable Care Act was passed. 1,000 pages. 1,000 pages of law. The regulations run up, depending on the size of the font, up to 10,000 pages. I wasn't going to read 1,000 pages of law. It's not who I am. It's not the way I'm built. Mm-hmm. And so I realized then that I was on the western side of the slope. But compare today's environment to the health care reimbursement environment of the 70s and 80s up until the early 90s, where reimbursement for Medicare was cost-based. Just remember that. So whatever your cost was, you got that plus more. And reimbursements to physicians were very generous, and costs weren't that big of an issue. And today it's quite different. Yeah, today, one of the things people say is, the three things you want in healthcare are low cost, high quality, and high access. And I can give you any two of those. Pick two, any two. I just can't give you three of them. That's where the problem is.
So do you have any thoughts about what the solutions might be?
Oh, absolutely.
And what do you, talk a little bit about that.
Well, this is radical, okay? I think the fundamental problem in healthcare is for-profit insurance companies. And after the election, Paul Ryan wants to privatize Medicare, which means allowing Medicare to be operated by for-profit insurance companies. Now, as I remember from my corporations class, for-profit companies owe a fiduciary duty to their shareholders to produce revenues, and they have contractual duties to their subscribers, their plan participants. Now, fiduciary, contractual, fiduciary takes precedence. Right. And so what's happening with the aggregation of healthcare being funded by for-profits, particularly if Medicare is privatized, is that our healthcare system will be controlled by for-profit insurance companies. Now that's a problem. Let me give you an example. Anthem, terrific company, came into New Hampshire, bought New Hampshire Blue Cross Blue Shield in '99, had bought Matthew Thornton in '98. I was involved in both transactions. Anthem is a for-profit company. In 2001, their stock price was $21. When I last looked this year, their stock price was $133. 15 years, 600%. Yeah. And the thing that makes it doubly interesting is they had a stock split in 2005. So it's not 600%.
Yeah.
It's about 1,000%.
Yeah.
So that value has accumulated in the shareholders of Anthem, which is what they're entitled to in terms of their investment. So I think we need to nationalize our healthcare system. The United States ranks 37th on the World Health Organization list of countries in terms of our outcomes. 37th. We rank number 1 on per capita spending. 137. You'd think they'd be a little closer.
You would.
France is number 1 in outcomes and spends $4,000 a year per capita. We spend over $9,000 a year per capita. 20 of the top 25 WHO countries are European and have nationalized medicine. So in nationalized medicine, access is for everybody. Quality is determined by outcomes in terms of populations, not individuals. And costs are determined in terms of national priorities and not net return to for-profit insurance companies. So I think that's going to be the solution. However, the United States spends 17% of its gross domestic product on healthcare. France is about half of that. We won't have a crisis until that 17% gets over 20%. And if it hits 24%, then our country will be spending so much on healthcare that we will be less competitive than the world in general. And that's when economic hard times will hit this country and the system will be seen as broken. when people are losing their jobs because our companies can't afford
Have them.
to handle this expense. So,
And where does malpractice insurance fit into all of this? I mean, there's been a lot of talk over the years about how much the cost of malpractice insurance adds to the healthcare cost. Is that a legitimate concern?
I don't think so.
Okay.
In my view, it's a minor. It's a
Okay.
minor concern, and some states have recovery limits that deals with it. Some states have apology laws, which allow treating doctors to apologize to the patients. And the data show that if a patient receives a sincere apology from his or her treating doctor, the chances of a lawsuit go way down. I mean, a simple, I'm sorry.
Yes.
And this is, for the lawyers listening to this, our legal system can be so counterproductive. The traditional advice to doctors in malpractice cases is never admit you've done anything wrong, never say you're sorry. And the data show that quite the opposite is the best course of action. It's just, I have the same feeling about employment matters. Employment lawyers tell their clients when they've fired their CEOs, don't say anything about it into the press. It's all personal and confidential. And so you read it and you automatically conclude, what are they trying to hide? And the disclosure of some information, it doesn't have to be confidential, but just some kind of context.
Yes.
That you think that the corporation that did the firing has a heart and a soul and some integrity, and it wasn't just a bruising power struggle. Even if it was, I think that sometimes we over-lawyer situations, and it's not to the benefit of our clients or society.
Well, I remember when I was on the board up at Mary Hitchcock hearing about those examples of doctors apologizing and what a tremendous influence it had on a lot of things. Number one, the mental health of the patient who was wronged, and number two, the fact that it tended to the apology tended to be accepted, and it did result in less litigation. So has anyone, are there institutions that are pursuing that approach today or not?
Sure, wherever, in states where it's allowed, they're pursuing it quite productively. Makes me think, let me ask you, are there lawyer apology statutes? I wonder if there's any state in the country that has a law that if a lawyer has made a mistake, that it's not admissible evidence if the lawyer apologizes to the client?
Yeah, I don't know of any, but then I don't know that I would know necessarily. But
I've apologized to clients.
I have too, yes.
And it probably takes a lot of courage to do that.
Yes.
You really hold yourself open and subject to criticism.
Yes.
And my experience is that if the client thinks you're sincere and if you really tried hard, it wasn't an apology for going to the beach and saying, oh, I don't care about that deadline,
Right.
that it has impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe we just should say more, I'm sorry, more in our whole lives.
That's right. A little kindness and a little.
So I'm sorry, this isn't as interesting an interview as you would like.
It's a pretty interesting interview, I think, and I think people will be very interested in hearing your perspectives on where we're going with healthcare, where we're not going with healthcare, depending upon what happens after the election. But let me go back, and let's go back to our list, and let's talk about a few more interesting characters. And one that I want to ask you about that he always makes me chuckle is Sherm Horton.
Oh,
so tell us about Sherm Horton.
Sherm was a classic. He was such a positive, happy person, and he was smart as hell. really smart as hell, and always presented his intelligence, at least in his dealings with me, in a humor sandwich. So, you'd have the bread, and it would be all the jokes and the funny things and the sarcasm, and in the middle of that sandwich, the luncheon meat was just a boom, a huge legal insight. I loved working with Sherman because he saw it as a team. He saw it as a team sport. Even if you're on the other side with Sherman, at least in my experience, it was fun and interesting, and it moved the ball forward. And one of the things that I liked about Sherm is that when he and his client Paul Paganucci, who was the VP for Financial Affairs at Dartmouth after a successful Wall Street career, would get me in a room, and I'd be representing the hospital or the clinic up in Hanover at Dartmouth College. They'd have these early morning meetings, and I'd walk into this room, a little small office in Parkhurst Hall at Dartmouth, and there would be this virtually impenetrable blue cloud of cigar smoke.
I was going to say, I never saw him without a cigar in his mouth.
Like
in
at
the courtroom.
8 in the morning. And I go, are you guys there, Paul, Sherm? And they'd be sitting there smiling, smoking on these huge stogies. And it was just classic. They were having fun.
Yeah.
Paul, I see his widow at the Aquinas House, the Catholic church I go to in Hanover, and talk to her regularly. Paul died of cancer of the throat, and he said on his way out that he regretted all those cigars that he smoked. And Sherm was right there with him.
Yep, he was. I remember seeing Sherm, cigar in his hand, driving. He had a little tiny, some kind of a little convertible of some kind. I remember drove all over New Hampshire in it.
He would just spread joy.
Yeah.
He
was married. His wife was Bill Johnson's wife's sister, Judge Bill Johnson's sister.
Really?
Yes. So they were sort of brothers-in-law.
Yeah. Oh, Bill.
Very different people in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I had one of my cases, my trials. Can you believe that? I had a few trials in my career. I was representing the New Hampshire Interscholastic Athletic Association. And the executive director wanted to keep this kid out of playing basketball, a fifth year at a high school. And Bill was the presiding judge. And the theory was that the young man had used up his eligibility. Mm-hmm. Well, the student had a limp, and he had some congenital malformity in his hip or something. And as a part of that, he had a lot of hospital care and missed some school time. And so I remember Bill was the presiding justice, and I had the student stand up and walk to the witness chair with his limp, and I could see Bill come out of his chair and look like this to get a really good look at the guy, and he sat down and he looked at me and he said, I knew that case was a loss.
Gone.
Bill had developed moral indignation over my client's position of keeping this kid from playing basketball. And you know what? He was exactly right.
Yeah, he made the right decision.
Exactly right.
Yeah. What about another person who, very interesting personality, Skip Smith?
Oh, Skip. Life's a series of stories, Susan. Skip was about as close to a cowboy as a lawyer of anybody I dealt with, in a very positive way. He would have fun poking the piñata. He would just enjoy it. And I remember in a divorce case I had with Skip. I wasn't actually doing the work, but Skip had the wife, and I had somebody at Oren Reno defending my client. And we went through all the pretrial stuff, and then just before the trial, he said, "Hey, Neil, come on over." So I went over to his office, and the die was cast. We were going forward in trial. And he said, "Yeah, I got something funny to tell you." And I said, "What, Skip?" And he said, "You know this judge that we have?" And I forget who the marital master was. And he said, "Well, I've had him now 4 or 5 times, and every time he's agreed with my position on the division of assets." And Skip was going for a 50-50 split for a long-term marriage, and I was trying to make the point that my client had such business acumen that he should get more of the money. And Skip showed me a couple of the decisions, and he laughed. He was just having a ball with it. And guess what the marital master did?
50-50.
50-50.
Well, this has been quite a treat, and I think our audience, whomever they may be, will enjoy very much having spent this hour with you. So I have to say in closing that you wear success well, and you've been very gracious, and thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much, Susan. I value our friendship, and I value our time together, and thank you for being such an expert interviewer.
Thank you.
This special New Hampshire Public Television presentation is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you for your support.